Hello and welcome to the Eastern Front. My name is Yulia Zhozha. I'm with the Middle East Institute, Georgetown and George Washington Universities, and I'm joined by
Dalibor Rohac with the American Enterprise Institute.
On our podcast, we talk about the many challenges to European peace that tend to emerge along a line running from the Baltic to the Black Sea, the Eastern Front, and about why those matter to the United States. If you enjoy this episode, please consider subscribing, rating, and reviewing us. Today, we are very happy and privileged to be joined by former Minister of Foreign Affairs, Andrei Kozyrev of the Russian Federation and Soviet Union. You were both. Thank you so much for being with us today. I'm proposing to start this off in the current times and looking into the future with a question that I'm sure it's not the first time that you're being asked, but I believe it's on very many people's minds on both sides of the Atlantic. And I heard this very often over the last few weeks from both Ukrainians and Russians. And that is the logic or the kind of the presumption that Putin is waiting for US elections and is waiting for Trump to come back. And that would, from his point of view, fix the outcome or get to the outcome that he wants to achieve in the war in Ukraine. What's your take on this? Do you think that's what he's hoping for?
Yes, I agree. He definitely does. But he actually likes the war of attrition anyway. I mean, that's his bet on Trump. Definitely. They liked Trump from the very beginning, and probably helped him from the very beginning, one way or the other. Anyway, Putin is quite comfortable with this long war. So Trump or not, but he bets on long war and on the West becoming tired or the war, feeling the war fatigue. And the Republican rebellion, so to say, now is a signal of that. But he also probably thinks that sooner or later, under the circumstances, the will of Ukraine will kind of weaken. Because, it's an unbelievable situation. It's a one-side destruction. Russians, Putin is able to bomb Ukrainian cities, Ukrainian infrastructure, Ukrainian population, whatever, and he sits in a sanctuary and gets nothing back. So why won't he kind of bet on time, on Trump and on time?
Earlier in the war, after the Russian failure to capture Kiev, you called Putin delusional and a lunatic acting out of desperation. At the same time, when you look at the Kremlin's pursuit of the war, it strikes me that Putin has actually been quite cautious and prudent in the way he approached the war, both domestically. I mean, he seems to understand that there are costs to these different waves of mobilization in political terms, and also very cautious in, not escalating and trying to bring NATO into the conflict, seemingly because he might understand that he would stand no chance in a conventional war against the alliance. So, what is the right way of understanding Putin's behavior? I mean, is it lunacy? Is it prudence? Is it prudence fueled by ideology that he seems to sort of subscribe to? What's the sort of mental model we are working here with?
It's probably all at once. Those things are not either one, or they are and rather. But yes, it's lunacy because he started the war and his whole reign, so to say, in Russia is a lunacy. It's totally against Russian national interests. That's number one. Then it was adventure, the war, the invasion, large invasion of Ukraine. And he definitely miscalculated. And he thought that the Ukrainians are a weak nation, that there is no nation even like Ukraine, and that they will crumble under a first push, so to say. And he wanted to be in Kiev, as people say, in 3 days or something. So that was complete miscalculation. A second miscalculation was that he thought that the West will not resist, almost like the previous time in 2014 when he occupied Crimea. So these two were miscalculations, but when I say that Putin is a lunatic or a crazy, that the whole thing is crazy, that's from our point of view, probably yours, mine, from anyone who observes it from the outside. And again, it's totally against Russian national interests. But he is not crazy in medical sense. He is quite a rational guy, not reasonable, but rational guy. If my English is not failing me, there is a difference. So he is rational, yes, and he calculative. He calculates his moves, and that's why he will not start the nuclear war. That's just a blackmail, and it's a pity that the United States and most Western countries seem to be kind of afraid of his nuclear threats. But he is evil, but not suicidal. He doesn't want to commit a nuclear suicide, and he does not wage the war in a way that would be suicidal for him, even in conventional. So that's why he avoids and will try to avoid by all means any military engagement with NATO. And that's why I think that if the West, the NATO, gave Ukraine the most sophisticated and most powerful weapons, and the Ukraine then would be able very quickly, though, to throw the Russian invaders back over the border, the internationally recognized border. He will not do anything particularly crazy. He will not press the nuclear button, or he will not go to war with NATO or anything like that. He will just present it like a great victory to Russian people. He has total propaganda, total control of the media, and that's it. So the question which you asked is, I think, the core question: whether Putin is suicidal? No. Whether Putin is completely irrational? No, he is rational. Is he mean? Is he a lunatic in a sense of sound-minded people? Of course. So none of these things is controversial. They all go together.
You already touched very early on, of course, the core that I don't think we can get away from. And I want to pause here and just say one thing apropos what you just explained, your understanding of the nuclear scenario that we're talking about so much. I teach European security here in Washington. And I have to talk about the nuclear aspect of this war too, and the fear of escalation. And from all the articles and work that has been written on this, also on the Western side, I've decided the easiest to understand is your personal Twitter feed on that. Your thread about nuclear escalation it is so clearly explained that I think is the best for us to understand. But I want to take advantage of having you here to ask you on the other side, the other aspect. You've been now in the United States for quite a while, and you're a sophisticated understander of our strategic culture and the way we're looking at this conflict. And so explain to us from your point of view, where fear of escalation is coming from. It's something that we certainly have tried to discuss a lot on this podcast with different guests and among ourselves. And we all have our opinions on this, but it's been the discussion about self-deterrence in the West when it comes to support for Ukraine has been essentially driven by fear of escalation. So how do you make sense of this?
Well, you're quite right. I'm living for a long time in the United States, and by all means, I will stay here. And I am taxpayer, so any penny spent on this war for me is as important as to those guys in Congress, especially the Republicans who are against helping Ukraine. They think that they could spare or economize on that, but it's not. It will be much more costly down the road to stay against Russian and Chinese, because Chinese are learning from this experience. But the fear comes from very natural source. It's very human, so to say, a reaction. It's nuclear weapons. Nuclear weapons are unbelievable, that they could destroy the world. And definitely Russia, and I think now China too, are able to destroy the United States as we speak, in 40 minutes from our conversation. If one of those guys presses the button, then the missiles will take 40 minutes to deliver, and there will be no conversation. So it is a very scary situation. But there is fear. Do I fear? Of course. I tell you an anecdote. When we invented a new approach in 1993, when I was foreign minister, and we wanted to be allies with the United States and all that, but disarmament, actual disarmament, physical disarmament, dismantling of those missiles and all that takes some time and effort. So we devised a trick. Like we said, we will not target anymore those intercontinental missiles. We will not target them to the United States. And that was done as much as possible. And then when I came to Washington to talk to President Clinton, he said, Andrei, what do you think is the most important change in, say, Russian or Moscow to Washington relationship? And I said, it's very easy. It's first time I don't feel threatened. I don't fear Russian nuclear warheads. See, I was foreign minister of Russia, and that was first time I came to the United States, not fearing to be killed in 40 minutes by Soviet or Russian and nuclear missiles. So that is very natural. The problem is to, like with any fear, there is always fear of something, and it's fearful to have a surgery, for instance, especially a complex surgery, but it's needed. So you have to rationalize, and that's where, as I said, Putin is rational personality, but the West kind of loses its rationality. It was a rational situation for more than, I think it's for at least 70 years after the so-called New Age came. And there is a new movie, a new film, very good, about this nuclear weapons and the horror of nuclear weapons. But they were needed at that time to defeat Japan and then to stand against the Russian Federation. So that's a given that it's dangerous situation. It is dangerous situation. I can't tell you that there is 100% guarantee, but you have to live under this situation and take it rationally. And since Putin is not suicidal, the most important is to stay firm. The answer to this fear, like the answer to most of other fears, is to stay firm. That means that if America and NATO countries provide supplies of the most powerful conventional weapons to Ukraine and allow Ukraine to push the Russian forces out, that would signal to Putin that the West is not fearful, that the West will not succumb to his pressure. And that's important to deter nuclear aggression. What stopped Soviet Union for years and Russia and China from pressing the nuclear button and liquidating the United States at will any moment? The only thing, the retaliation, they know that automatically the American missiles will come back and they will be totally destroyed too. That's called MAD, mutually assured destruction. But that mutually assured destruction is assured not only by physical ability to do that by missiles, but it's assured by determination. So the most important in this game is to show the determination to strike back. Determination to strike back in Ukraine by Ukrainians, and by the implication, determination to strike back if the missiles come. And one is after the other. You know, that's total mistake to think that if you consent or if you give something in Ukraine, then you diminish the possibility of total and complete destruction. It's totally different. It's opposite situation. If you show weakness in one place, the other guy would definitely think that you might show weakness in other places, right? But if you show determination in one place, then he thinks, oh no, of course they will retaliate if I use nuclear weapons. Not necessarily all the missiles to the United States, complete destruction, but they are playing with an idea of throwing a nuclear bomb, for instance, on, say, Brussels, which is capital of NATO or the center of the NATO. Why? Because, and that's where Ukraine is particularly important. If they could scare the United States out of using all its force to help Ukraine, that is in Europe, because Ukraine is the center of Europe geographically, then they might think, oh, why won't we go further? And again, the United States and other countries might be fearful enough to swallow it. So that's the point. The point is not to give the other guy, especially like Putin or like Xi, with due respect. Xi is different, of course, but nevertheless, not to give those guys an impression that they can get away with anything or with something. No. And that was the deterrence, strategic deterrence used by NATO. That's why the NATO was created and used by the United States. And President Reagan actually epitomizes this approach. He came to Western Germany and said, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. Then when Soviets deployed, I was then in the Soviet Foreign Ministry, I remember that. And again, the idea of deploying missiles in Russia, but those were missiles able to reach only Europe, not the United States. So see, that was the idea, that let us detach the United States, so-called nuclear umbrella, from Europe, and then we'll take Europe by conventional forces, because Americans will not use nuclear weapons against us. And what was the answer of President Reagan? That was the only one reasonable. He did not negotiate. He just said, if you don't remove immediately, if you don't liquidate those so-called medium range that is not reaching to the United States nuclear missiles, I will deploy my missiles of the same range in Europe, in Germany. And he did. And when he did, I was then a relatively high position in the Soviet Foreign Ministry, and I can testify that before he actually did deploy those weapons, it was just empty talk. There were discussions, there were negotiations, so-called disarmament negotiations, but Soviets were not serious in those negotiations because they thought that they can scare Americans out of Europe. But when he started deployment of those weapons, then it was a sobering point for the Soviet leadership. And then the Soviet leadership told us, diplomats in the Soviet Foreign Ministry, hey, start to negotiate seriously with Americans. We don't need those weapons near our border. So that's the historic lesson, unfortunately mostly forgotten, but that's how the deterrence, how peace was kept during the whole of the nuclear era.
So I wonder if we could just probe you a little bit more to offer us more historical lessons, given the fact that it's not every day that we would have somebody on the podcast who was not only a first-hand witness to many of these critical events in Russian, Central, and Eastern European history, but who was also a mover and shaker in those. You published in 2019 a memoir of your time as Russia's foreign minister. It's called Firebird: The Elusive Fate of Russian Democracy, and we'll include it in the show notes. We commended highly to our listeners. So I suppose my question to you is, what would you tell to those Americans, and we have, Julia and I, friends who are of the realist persuasion, if you will, who continue to cling to this narrative that Russia's war against Ukraine is ultimately a result of a broken promise that supposedly Secretary Baker extended to Russia in the 1990s, and then it's promising not to expand NATO to the east, and NATO ended up expanding to the east, including countries that were once part of the Soviet Union, and that the prospect of Ukraine joining the ranks of those countries was just intolerable for the Kremlin, and that a war of this kind would have taken place, regardless of who was in the Kremlin, that it was just not an acceptable outcome given the importance of Ukraine to Russia. Where does this narrative go wrong?
Across the board. It's everything is just malicious invention. First of all, when I was foreign minister, I was accused of not demanding the West to stick to the promise, which you mentioned, made allegedly to Gorbachev. So being in power at that time, I ordered to look through all the archives, all the papers around those dates, and that they are kept there, like every other state. They are keeping the archives, and we found none of a treaty, none of an agreement or anything. We found some phrases taken by a note taker. When they speak, there is a note taker, especially interpreters. I used to speak English with Baker. He was great teacher even for me as a professional. And there is a considerable difference in age also, so I enjoyed so much working with him. But anyway, there was a note taker around on both sides. And in the notes, there is a little hint that one day, it was long before the Soviet Union collapsed and Russia became, it was even before the Germany collapsed, like Soviet side of the Germany, Eastern Germany, and joined the Western side. Then it was meant by Gorbachev that if they walk out of the Warsaw Pact, I don't know whether it clears or not the picture, because not everyone remembers probably what was the Warsaw Pact. So the Warsaw Pact was like a counterbalance. In fact, NATO was counterbalance to the Warsaw Pact, but it was kind of an agreement of the Soviet domination, I would put it this way, of Eastern Germany and other Eastern European countries. And at that point, nobody even discussed the joining of the two parts. The only thing was that all the Eastern European countries wanted to run out of the Warsaw Pact. And all of them also, at the same time, wanted immediately to join NATO. So at that time, the Soviet concern, the Gorbachev concern, was that, okay, I will, and that was historic, his historic achievement. He said, I would tolerate them going out of the Warsaw Pact if they want so much. But it would be difficult for me to swallow that they immediately go to the NATO. And in this context, Baker probably said, no, it's not in the cards. I mean, nobody even thinks of that. It was too far away thinking, because Germany was still divided. There was still the wall. And then when the wall crumbled, by the way, it so happened that I was those days having consultations with Eastern German diplomats in Berlin. So I was so privileged to witness actually the destruction of the wall in Berlin at that moment. So, but after that, no such discussion was even continued, because the events went like avalanche. The Eastern Europeans took their fate in their hands, so to say. The Soviets tolerated them leaving the Warsaw Pact, and then they started to knock to NATO. But that was so far-fetched because it takes time. Even the most advanced Eastern European countries, politically advanced at that time, Poland, Hungary, and Czech Republic, it took 7 to 8 years for them to actually get prepared, to actually go through all the procedures which should be done, because it's very easy to boil an egg, but it's impossible to unboil an egg. And so, the Soviets made them socialist or whatever. And then to undo that, to make them again a normal countries, democracies able to join NATO, that took at least 7 to 8 years for the most advanced. So at that time, the whole conversation was so far-fetched and so almost like, science fiction that nobody took those words seriously. So all that is invention. All that is speculation. We have not found anything like that, and it's just a misinterpretation of history, which Putin and the regime uses across the board. They go back to Kievan Rus, that is 1,000 years ago, and they claim that because there was a Kievan Rus, then Russia has a kind of a right to retake Kiev back. When, I mean, if you look at European history, where are we going in that case? We're going probably to Charles I in France, and
or maybe getting the Vikings back to England.
Exactly. I mean, Italy did not exist at that time. I mean, the European map was completely different. Like the professor knows it much better than me. So, I mean, this historic misinterpretation, because they have nothing of history and just inventions. But they are dangerous because those guys playing them in internal propaganda, and they playing those things to feed those guys in the West who probably have no idea of any kind of history of Eastern Europe, of Russia, Ukraine, or even Western Europe, unfortunately. But they need a pretext to cover their fear. It's fear and greed of some international companies, of some businessmen who try to do business in Russia like nothing happened, So it's greed and fear. And for them, that's probably useful to have this kind of mythos of history.
So before we let you go, I want to also ask you about something that you mentioned a little bit earlier, and also something that I think is on a lot of people's minds, and that is the Russia-China alliance, partnership, relationship, call it what you want. There's been a lot of speculation apart from the data that we have in terms of China helping Russia with sanctions evasion, and China trying to cooperate with Russia over the years as much as possible when it comes to military transfers and military technology. And we know how advanced that is. But when it comes to common goals, the shared hate for the West, and when it comes to actual cooperation on the ground, there's been a lot of speculation of whether this can truly be a stable and deep alliance that is forming, and we're seeing signs here and there, or it is more of a marriage of convenience, where Russia needs now any kind of partner, and China is helping, but only to the extent that it's right now convenient. How do you see this? You've looked at China through different lenses over the years. Now looking over 1.5 years into the full-scale invasion and what we know of China's role, what do you make of this relationship?
Well, I would not call it marriage even of convenience. It's just a relationship of convenience. And as you said absolutely correctly, the only major kind of driver of this relationship is, as you said, hate to the West. But even that is different because China has vast economic engagement, vast economic interests with the West. And the United States is by far, uncomparably, even a bigger economic partner of China, even today, and in foreseeable future, than Russia. So even there is big difference. The big difference, to my mind, is also in outlook of the West in both countries. For Putin, anti-Western politics, and especially anti-Western propaganda, is vital because he cannot compete, cannot present anything to the Russian people, especially in development, in economic sphere. He was very, very unsuccessful in that. His only kind of chip is oil and gas and some other natural resources. While China is different, the Chinese Communist Party kept power and is keeping power not only by propaganda and intimidation, that's true for Putin too, but with one very different reason. They present to Chinese people so far quite successfully that they have competitive development, competitive economic structure, economic system. Recently, very recently, only a year, probably 2 years, they start to suffer from some economic problems, but nobody knows whether those problems are long-standing or they are just an episode, like it's natural for any economy. So still today, they claim that their system is better, their economic system, and given their engagement, involvement in world economy, their hate of the West is different. They don't want to destroy the existing system, international system, because it's very comfortable for them and very lucrative in the end for them to use this system for their economic development. They just want corrections. They want to criticize the West. Sometimes they say, oh, we don't agree with the system. We want to overthrow the system. But it's quite unclear what they want actually to do. It's more or less these two parties in the United States, which every presidential and other election says, oh, we need to change everything. It was disaster last 4 years, but then when they come to power, it turns out that it's more or less the same, so that looks like the Chinese approach. So Russia wants to destroy the system. They want to criticize and probably correct the system. So that's two very different agendas. And Russia and China are historic rivals, if not enemies. The Chinese recently also returned to some of those maps, officially returned to those maps where parts of Russian territory, of today's Russian territory, marked like Chinese territory. And that's very small fraction of what they really think should belong to them. Because for last 2 centuries, Russia really sliced from the former. I mean, it does not justify any kind of territorial, because, these historic narratives, they are completely wrong. I mean, even if they correct factually, but they are wrong as a guide for today's policy. As I said, if European countries come back not centuries ago, but just decades ago, and start to correct the map according to those old maps, it would be total and complete disaster. So it does not justify anything. It just, but it's important to understand the Chinese think that they were unfairly treated by Western countries, which is true, and they were as unfairly and probably even more unfairly treated by Russia, which is also true. Why more? Because the Western countries did not take parts of Chinese territory. They made their various things, which they thought was interference, but Russians actually took the territory, that is, diminished China territorial possessions. So these are irreconcilable, and neither one wants a superpower stronger than itself on its borders. When I came to be foreign minister, I first met with Chinese and I said, guys, let us forget what happened in the past. Let us discuss the border fairly according to today's norms, and let us have good neighbor relations, not alliance against the United States, not anything like from the past, but just good neighbor, because we are neighbors and we have to be neighbors. And the response of the Chinese was very immediate, actually. And they said, yes, you are right. And then we had very good relations, actually, with China. And there was Chairman Jiang Zemin, who even sang songs to me in Russian, because he went before in his youth to Leningrad, which is now St. Petersburg University. So he had a little command of Russian, and he liked the songs of his youth. So China is different. China menace and China a real challenge to the United States. It's probably bigger than Russian in economic terms, and it should be addressed, but it's blown out of proportion politically. And I think it's a little damaging for the United States, especially those trade, actions, unilateral trade restrictions which were taken under Trump. That served nothing but exaggerating tensions. Anyway, there is no alliance, and there will be. That is impossible, and any real alliance between Russia and China. What is possible, though, that if Russia continues the war in Ukraine for as long as it takes, then it finds itself in a situation when there is, as you mentioned, no other way to go but to China, because India, which is also trading now at times more in Russian oil and gas, but they are far away. And China is just right here, and so in that case, if Russia continues to separate itself from Western Europe, which was and still is probably the largest by far economic partner of Russia, then they will go to China, but they will not go to China as equal partners. They will go to China out of desperation. When Chinese see that they have nowhere else to go, Russians, in Chinese mythology, there is a northern bear and a southern or Chinese dragon. So if the dragon sees that his opponent, to put it mildly, the bear, comes crawling to him in desperation, selling oil, gas, and other national resources, because otherwise nobody will buy anything, and the economy is based on exports, the Russian economy. So of course the dragon, even if he is good-willing, the most good of dragons, would say, of course, come. But you will be my vassal. You will be my servant, because you have no way to go. And that's possible that in some years down the road, China will just swallow Russia as a weak partner, and that dragon will subdue and will probably domesticate the bear, if not eaten the bear. So that's the only one scenario when Russia might become a real kind of part of a Chinese strategy. That could be avoided if, again, the West gives enough powerful weapons right away to Ukraine. Ukraine defeats Russia on its territory, pushes Russia from its territory, and after that, there will be again a possibility of reestablishing some kind of economic relations between West, between the NATO countries or whatever, the Western countries, and Russia, and give Russia again an alternative to Chinese market only, an alternative like it was always, that Russia traded to the West and traded with the East, by far more with the West because it's much more developed countries and all that. So again, we come to the simple truth that the nuclear threat will be diminished only giving Ukraine victory over its territory. The Chinese threat could be diminished only by giving Ukraine weapons to liberate its territory, and it should not be done as long as it takes, because that's what Putin wants. He can do it as long as it takes, but it should be done as soon as possible.
That's certainly a great way to end this podcast. Minister Andrei Kozyrev, thank you so much for joining us. We hope that you'll join us again soon.
Thank you. Thank you. All the best. Thank you.
From me, Yulia Zhozha, and my friend
Dalibor Rohach.
Thank you for listening to the Eastern Front. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider subscribing, rating, and reviewing us. To stay up to date with the Eastern Front, please give us a follow on Twitter or X at Eastern Front Pod, one word, and sign up for our newsletter included in the show notes. You can find more episodes and additional content on our website, ai.org, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you, and until next time, goodbye.